Odin. A Paranormal Protector Tale. Book 3 in the Heart of Ice series. Written by Demelza, Carlton. 1. The sundial in the courtyard greeted Freyja like a nightclub bouncer that wasn't sure she was well dressed enough for tonight's crowd, but was forced by necessity to let her pass anyway. The feeling was mutual. The weird ornate metal sculpture that made absolutely no sense to her, all twisted and jagged, yet somehow able to tell the time. When it wasn't covered in snow, of course. It was supposed to be summer. The archaeology team had already gone up into the mountains to start the dig early, what with the early snowmelt leaving the site bare. But now if it was snowing again, who knew whether they'd be digging or coming back? Not that she should really be worried about them. They had gear that was rated for Mount Everest, so a small snowstorm in the Jotunheimen Mountains wouldn't be a problem. Carl didn't let a little thing like a blizzard send him home early. The guy was as obsessive about archaeology as her dentist brother was about flossing. And this time, Carl had already made a discovery so great, they'd called in a helicopter recovery team, which was almost unheard of. Carl insisted a helicopter was only used as a last resort, because of the carbon emissions from the flight and global warming and all, yet he'd called for this one. Had he really found his iceman? The holy grail of every ice archaeologist? Saint Nick would be frothing at the mouth if he had. The shirt he'd found last season was nothing compared to finding the shirt's owner, still frozen inside it. Well, she'd soon find out when the helicopter arrived. "We will find it and we will need you," Carl had said before leaving, like it was some kind of prophecy. Freyja snorted, just like she'd done then. Prophecies were the stuff of fantasy novels about chosen ones and boys becoming heroes. Not for disgraced doctors, who'd never work in a hospital again. She dug out her phone, wanting to check the message from Lara again. Maybe she should go inside, instead of waiting out here in the cold for the helicopter to arrive. The phone network access had improved since her last trip up here. 2 bars instead of 1, though it might drop to 0 again if Carl's snowstorm crossed the mountains to here. Her predecessor had told stories about the blizzards up here. Apparently the poor woman had been snowed in for a month, when she'd been caught here in an early autumn blizzard. The lab might only be a 15-minute walk to town in normal weather, but the town may as well be as far away as the moon once the snow started to stick. Or worse, turn to ice. Funny, that ice was both her bane and her reason for being here at Ice Lab. A bog body. An ice mummy. And she'd be the first person to actually see it, in its entirety. All right, maybe Carl's excitement and stubborn certainty had infected her, just like that new virus spreading through so many major cities. She was safer up here, in this isolated laboratory, than back at the main university campus. But if this discovery was so important, surely there should be a team, not just her. What if she did something wrong and damaged the body? Carl would never forgive her. The academic community would never forgive her. They still hadn't forgiven her for the mistake she hadn't actually made with a patient, almost 3 years ago, and no one would listen to her now whether it was her fault or not. Freyja swallowed. One corpse had ended her medical career, but this body might be her redemption. Sure, it was Carl's discovery, but this stranger in the ice could be her salvation. Or something at least, to rebuild her career on. Now she just had to hope he'd been dead for a few centuries at least, and wasn't some Nazi who'd been running away from the trial for his horrible war crimes. Then again, if he was a Nazi, no one would care if she made any mistakes dealing with the body. But he also wouldn't be as big news as Carl was hoping for. He might not even be a he. Maybe it would be an ice woman. Take that, scientific community, she thought to herself. What would all those old male academics do if they discovered their holy grail was actually a woman? They'd lose their minds. An ice mummy even. Freyja grinned. She'd be calling it that until proven otherwise, and maybe even afterwards. After all, a man mummified in the ice was still a mummy. She glanced at her watch. She hoped the helicopter would hurry up. She was supposed to video call her mother this afternoon. She'd thought she was running late, but it looked like the chopper wasn't even here yet. The thumping sound of the blades hit her first, a visceral heartbeat that her own ribs vibrated along with. Only it wasn't coming from the mountains, but from the other direction entirely. What the actual fuck? Had the helicopter not even made it to the dig site yet? Maybe it would have been faster to send the pack horses. Then again, the weight of that much ice would be too much for a horse, surely. Hence the helicopter was the only option. The helicopter that was definitely coming in to land, blowing snow around like it was trying to blast the dirt off the buildings. Even Freyja had to duck back under cover, taking shelter in the lee of a wall that bore a warning sign in 3 languages, only one of which she was fluent in. Beware rotor downwash. Do not pass until helicopter has landed. There was a red line marked on the sign that was hidden somewhere under the layer of snow. Though once the helicopter was done sandblasting, snowblasting, the place, maybe she'd learn where the line was so she could stay behind it. When she looked again, the helicopter had landed squarely on the H in the middle of the helipad, the circle now clearly visible. Unfortunately, he'd completely missed the sundial. The pilot cracked open the door as the rotors slowed. Freyja grabbed her trolley and trundled it out as best she could through the snow. She hadn't done this since she was a med student on rotation in the emergency department, and there'd been a really bad boating accident where they'd literally pulled people out of the water and flown them straight to hospital. She doubted she'd be doing triage on today's patient, though. Or ever again. Sorry I took so long. Had to stop for decontamination first, the pilot shouted as he opened the rear door. The strong smell of cleaning chemicals leaped out, nearly blinding her. It must be some new protocol to do with the virus, Freyja decided. At least it was more effective than endless use of hand sanitizer. After delivering the medevac patient, the pilot continued. Freyja's heart skipped a beat. One of the expedition team needed medical evacuation? Are they all right? The pilot shrugged. Don't know. Didn't wait around long enough to find out. From what I can gather, he got into a fight with a wolverine and he didn't win. I could barely fly with the stench, so I stopped for a clean before I came here. You should be thanking me. You can't smell a thing now. He grinned. Yeah, but that was because the cleaning chemicals had seared her sinuses halfway up to her brain. As long as none of it had touched the ice mummy. Who was hurt? The pilot shrugged again. A Dr. Fridolfsson or something? Dr. Fridolfsson, Freyja corrected. Saint Nick fighting the wildlife. Now that was a new one. Maybe, the pilot conceded. Now, you got anyone else here to do the heavy lifting, or is it just us? Freyja grinned. I'll do it by myself if you're not strong enough. Worked every time on male orderlies as well as male pilots. No patient ever took more than 2 people to lift. Of course, she hadn't counted on this patient being encased in close to a ton of ice. After half an hour of huffing, puffing, pulling, pushing and a shitload of swearing, they got the body bag onto the trolley. It definitely took 2 of them to wheel it inside, and to transfer the mummy's ice coffin out of the body bag, and onto one of the mortuary trolleys with a drip tray for autopsies. If anyone in med school had told her she'd be doing autopsies for a living, she'd have laughed them out of the university. Now, she still wasn't sure she believed it. She barely noticed the pilot leaving, as she focused on the mummy. Well, the giant ice block, really, that Carl had assured her contained a person. She'd have to defrost it a bit more before she could confirm it. Freyja considered taking a couple of preliminary X-rays, just to be sure, then glanced at her watch. No, she'd promised to call her family, and who knew when everyone's rosters would match up again. The ice mummy could wait. Besides, what if there were other things frozen in the ice with them, obscuring the X-ray? Rocks, other artifacts, who knew what? Better to wait until more of the ice had melted, so she could get a clearer picture of who this person was. They'd keep. If Carl was right, they'd waited 1,000 years under the ice. A few more hours in the necropsy refrigerator wouldn't hurt them. Not like they'd know. 2. Are you sure you're safe there? Because we would prefer you to be here at home. Doctors are considered essential personnel, you know, even with the borders closed, and your father's been bringing in specialists through the quarantine every week, so we know exactly what to put in your application. With the virus having everyone so scared, hospitals are recruiting like nobody's business. I'm sure they'd even overlook that tiny incident 3 years ago if you were to apply. Mum wheedled. Freyja tried not to grimace. As a bariatric surgeon, Mum's entire career hinged on her optimistic sales pitch that she could deliver weight loss miracles to her patients. But Freyja didn't believe in miracles, especially not the sort her mother sold. The only doctor jobs back home for her would be as an overworked country GP in the middle of nowhere, or as a public health officer writing endless policy and protocols for the pandemic every time the WHO issued another update. No mum, it's fine. Healthcare in Norway is every bit as good as it is at home, and I'm probably safer here than I would be on a plane anyway. I have an entire lab facility to myself, while our fieldwork staff are out at site, and the only people I'll have any contact with are our team for the whole summer. I have more chance of catching some primeval mammoth plague than I have of catching the virus you're so worried about. Mum opened her mouth to protest. Besides, things just got rather interesting here. I can't say much yet, but the team discovered something in the glacier that could be big news. Something I can't wait to work on, she lied. Well, sort of lied. She had to wait until the body defrosted, and she was more nervous than excited about what she might find out when it did. Ooh, are you talking to Freyja? Hey sis. Are you remembering to floss? Freyja rolled her eyes. Fintan and his floss. Oh yeah, 10 times a day. Did you know they sell whalebone floss here? From real baleen whales, because they still hunt whales in Norway. Much better for the environment than plastic, as it's biodegradable, too. Wait, did you say you've seen whales while you're in Norway? Oh, please take pictures for me. I heard all the Viking legends about sea monsters are actually whale penis sightings. Krakens and sea serpents, and maybe even the Loch Ness monster. Kendall's eyes danced. Trust a urologist to make every conversation about penises. I doubt I'll see any whale penises or any penises alone in the lab, Freyja said dryly. Kendall's face fell. None at all? Aren't there any hot Vikings you can take to bed? You are in Norway. I mean, you could always offer them a free prostate check. That's always worked for me. Of course it had. Kendall flirted as easily as breathing, and male patients were only too happy to have her examine their bits, especially when she made it a habit of cooing over how big and impressive they were. Freyja couldn't remember the last time she'd seen, let alone handled, a man's. No. I don't want to hear about my sister's love life. Fintan complained, clapping his hands to his ears. Take care. See you later, sis. Mum muttered something Freyja couldn't quite catch, rising from her seat so Kendall could sit down. Dad said to say he loves you and to take care. He got called in because of some sort of hospital emergency. A ship with infected people aboard or something. But now everyone else is gone, spill. Have you met any hot guys? Freyja shook her head. I've been really busy with work, and there's no one else here. Even the caretaker quit at the start of the season, and while I heard they'd hired a new guy, I haven't seen him yet. Everyone else is out at an archaeological dig for the summer. Yeah, but you can't tell me small towns in Norway are as remote as the ones here in Australia. How far away is the nearest pub? 15 to 20 minutes on foot, depending on the depth of the snow, Freyja admitted. So what's stopping you from going there tonight and getting some hot Norse cock? Kendall asked. I have a lot of work to do. Like I told Mum. Kendall blew a raspberry. It's the weekend. Universities don't work weekends. You are free to fuck the brains out of whatever hottie you pick up, until Monday morning. I don't pick up random men in bars, Freyja said. No, you don't pick up men anywhere. You're like a nun, you have been since high school. Freyja sighed. It wasn't her fault she wasn't as clever as the rest of the family. Getting into med school had meant studying way more than Fintan or Kendall, and even then she'd barely scraped in. She'd had no time for messing around with guys, let alone a relationship. I want you to promise me something, Kendall began. Kendall. Promise me you will go to the pub tonight and have a drink, and a conversation with a man you'd at least consider having steamy hot sex with. Okay. Kendall. Kendall got that steely look her biggest, toughest male patients knew not to argue with. I'm worried about you, Freyja. Worried you'll end up all alone with nothing but a herd of cats, until you go mad and try to harness them up to a chariot to take you places. Please. Go Norse cock hunting. For me. Freyja couldn't help it. She burst out laughing. What would Mum say if she heard you say that? Kendall grinned. She'd shake her head and say she does not want to see the pictures. But I do. Big hairy cock pictures, please. Freyja buried her head in her hands. I am not sending you dick pics. Solicited dick pics are totally acceptable. Now, this is what you're going to do. I want you to repeat after me, pub, penis, pictures. Kendall glared into the camera. Say it. Freyja blew out a breath. Okay, I'll go to the pub. But no promises. Yes. Dick pics incoming. Kendall cheered before ending the call. Freyja shook her head. Kendall was right though. She didn't have anything to do this weekend, while the body defrosted. And when it did, she'd be flat out, running every test she could to work out as much as she could about the person. Maybe she should go to the pub, just for a little while. And if she met a man she liked, who she'd like even more naked, then maybe. Maybe. That was all. She pulled her coat on, locked up, and headed outside to the garage where she'd parked her car. Of course the helicopter had blown all the snow up against the roller door, so she'd have to spend an hour or two shoveling to get it out. But there were the two sleek new electric scooters the university had bought. She could squeeze one of them out the snow-free side door, no worries. Plus, instead of leaving her car in the pub car park, she could put the scooter in the boot of the guy's car, if she did find someone worth getting naked with. Not that she'd be getting naked tonight. But it might be nice. Freyja buckled on her helmet, and walked the scooter out into the courtyard before she could second-guess herself. She'd promised Kendall. She'd go to the pub, order a drink and a sausage, take pictures and then go home. Mission accomplished. She was a little unsteady at first, almost losing her balance once or twice on the drive to the main road, but as she turned onto the road, she felt confident enough to open up the throttle, to get a little speed. Just as she hit an ice patch. The scooter went flying and so did she, tumbling through the air headed downhill way too fast, until the whole world went white. 3. Odin had never been so cold in his life, and he'd fallen into a fjord once when he was ice fishing. This felt like his blood had turned to sleet, but he couldn't even shout for help because he was surrounded by ice. Yet he could move. He fell a short distance to a floor that was warmer than ice, but not by much. Like he'd fallen out of bed onto flagstones, after waking from a bad nightmare. Only, he'd never had a nightmare quite like this. He blinked his eyes open, then could not help but stare around the small square room. All the walls were made of shiny metal, and the ceiling too. Everything but the floor, which consisted of square flagstones in shiny ice white. Fuck. Ice. Help. Down through the not ice floor and the earth below, then through snow and actual ice to where the call was coming from. A woman wearing the most peculiar helmet, buried in a snowdrift. Odin reached for her, lifting her up. Her eyes blinked open, blue as are the ice on the fjords in winter. And Odin fell in love. 4. Freyja was cold and wet, and bumping up and down like she was on a small boat at sea. Which made no sense because she could have sworn she'd been on a scooter, nowhere near the water. She forced her eyes open. Yes, she recognized the snow piled up on either side of the road to the lab. She'd driven down here in her car only this morning. But the bumping. She squirmed so she could see. A hard chest that she was pressed against. Bulging arm muscles as the chest's owner carried her. What kind of man walked around shirtless in the snow? A man whose grip tightened around her so she didn't fall. Must get you inside, somewhere safe and warm, so we can see if you are injured from your fall, he rumbled. Yes, her fuzzy head agreed. She'd been thrown from her scooter. Might have broken bones or internal injuries. At least she was wearing a helmet. She patted her head, but all she felt was her own hair. Well, she had been wearing a helmet. Maybe Dr. Hardbody here had removed it, or it had fallen off. As long as it had done its job of protecting her beforehand. She pointed up the driveway. Take me to the lab. We should have everything we need in the first aid room there. And if not, she could always call an ambulance. Carl would have a connoption if she called the helicopter back to airlift her out. But she didn't think she was that badly hurt. Her pride felt more bruised than the rest of her. Falling off one of the scooters before she'd even made it to the pub for a drink. Worse, before she met a man worth getting naked with. Then again, this one was half naked already, and she couldn't deny she liked what she saw. Maybe she did have a head injury. But with no pain, nausea or dizziness, she'd already made a diagnosis way before they reached the first aid room. No serious injuries, but in need of dry clothes to prevent hypothermia. So she directed him to take her to the guest room, where she'd left her suitcase instead. She stripped off her coat, then her sweater, and was about to shuck off her jeans when she realized he was still in the room with her. And while she'd been undressing, he'd taken off everything. Holy fuck. All the marble in Rome couldn't hold a candle to him. This man was made of muscles. Her memory started to name them, like she would have back in med school, but she just shook her head to clear away any unnecessary thoughts. This veritable god of a man was standing here in her bedroom, naked, his enormous cock saluting her with the same eagerness she felt. Her mouth was dry. Thank you for saving me from the snow, and carrying me all the way back here. I don't suppose you'd be interested in a night of hot sex, as a thank you. He frowned. Are you not injured? Freyja slowly shook her head as she stripped off the rest of her clothes. Nope, not injured. Good to go all night. Oh God, had she said that bit out loud? Because she was. She wanted to climb him like a tree, wrap her legs around those thick thighs and grab his ass with both hands while he fucked her into next week with that monster cock. So she wrapped her arms around his neck and kissed him with everything she had. Fuck me, he breathed, his eyes wide with wonder. That's the plan, she replied as he lifted her up. 5. It took every bit of his self-control not to spin her around, slam her into the wall and fuck her standing, but this wasn't about a quick release, even if they had just met. No, he intended to adore her all night, if she had the stamina for it, as she said. So he laid her reverently on the bed, an enormous affair that was more than big enough for the two of them. Bigger than the bed he'd shared with Frigg, that one time they'd lain together and conceived the twins. He shook his head. He would not think of her tonight. Tonight he had a willing woman who wanted him in her bed, who spread her legs as her eyes welcomed him to do whatever he wished with her. For the second time that night, he fell in love. Here. She held out her hand, then stroked it down his cock, sheathing him in a layer of something so thin and translucent, it was like it wasn't there at all. An ingenious device to catch his seed, when he spilled it. He rubbed the head of his cock against her most sensitive parts. So wet and ready for him. I need to feel you inside me, she moaned, lifting her hips to grind against him. By all the gods, he was a man, not a saint. Odin thrust deep. Gods, she was tight around him. Was she a maiden still? Well, not now, but before he'd entered her. Dare he continue, or should he wait for her to grow accustomed to his girth? Yes, more please, she ordered. Odin surrendered to her pleasure, for the gods knew he wanted her just as much as she desired him. 6. The first orgasm rolled through Freyja like a breaking wave, and she was embarrassed to admit she squeezed his ass for every moment of it, it was so good. The second followed the first so quickly, it took her by surprise, stealing her vision for a few precious seconds so that she could do nothing but feel the incredible sensations of this man pounding away inside her. And the third, oh the third. She knew she was close when he suddenly stilled inside her, and she feared that in reaching his own release, he'd give her no more tonight. But while he still filled her, buried to the hilt in her core, his fingers reached for her clit and sent her spiraling into her own climax, clenching down so hard on him she feared she'd hurt him. But he just wrapped his arms around her, pulling her against his perfectly sculpted chest, while she tried to catch her breath. Maybe Kendall had been right. All she'd needed was some hot, hard Norse cock to help point the way to what she wanted. Yes, she'd worked hard to be as successful in her medical career as the rest of her family, until one terrible mistake had derailed it and sent her here. But she could still be happy and successful in other ways. Maybe not as a doctor in a hospital, like she'd originally hoped, but the Iceman was a new opportunity to change her life, to forge a new career out here, using all she'd learned in med school as well as the postgraduate forensic science degree she'd picked up since starting her job here. Tomorrow, she'd draft up a press release to send to the university PR department about the find, perhaps even with some pictures, when he'd defrosted enough. Pictures. Kendall had wanted pictures. She glanced down. The hot Norseman's cock was still buried inside her, hot and hard like he was ready to go again. Maybe even all night. His cock was all hers. Kendall couldn't have him. Not even a picture. She bucked her hips against him. Do you want some more? Fuck yes, he said. 7. When she fell asleep in his arms, so sated with pleasure she still wore a smile on her face, even in sleep, Odin finally withdrew from her delicious body. Never in his life had he known such a glorious night. Even the pleasures of Valhalla would be a poor shadow in comparison. But right now she needed sleep, and he did not. No, what he needed to do was protect her. Like he'd failed to do with Frigg. Odin shook his head. He'd failed once, but he would not fail again. Things were already different this time. For a start, the amazing sex. Not a drunken fumble in the dark that he barely remembered, over before it had really begun. No, tonight had been a feast for the senses. The sort he wished could go on for days and nights. If only they did not need to sleep. So while she slept, he would protect her. Learn the lay of her strange longhouse, which he'd barely glimpsed as he carried her inside. Find out if she had food supplies sufficient for the winter, and hunt for what she needed. And return to warm her bed when she awoke. Yes. It was time to forget the past, and embrace what the fates had granted him. Maybe even no happiness. But only if he could protect her properly, he told himself as he slid out of her bed. Duty before pleasure always. 8. Freyja wasn't sure whether to be disappointed or relieved that last night's lover had left when she woke. She wouldn't have said no to another round. Fuck, he'd been amazing in bed, but she'd never brought a man home or slept in the same bed as one she'd have to share breakfast with the next morning. But if he was gone, there was nothing she could do about it. She hadn't even gotten his name or number. If she was desperate, there was definitely DNA on the condoms, but that would be a bit weird, surely. It wasn't like having a one-night stand was a crime or anything. It wasn't until she reached the kitchen that she noticed the time. Past lunchtime. She really had been up late last night, to sleep right through until afternoon. Which then begged the question, seeing as it wasn't morning anymore, would it be wrong to cook one of the frozen pizzas for breakfast? It was kind of a late lunch, after all. She dug out a Hawaiian pizza, which looked like it had been sitting in the freezer since last year's expedition. It was so covered in ice, and stuck it in the oven. She had yet to meet anyone else, back home or here in Norway, who could properly appreciate the sheer genius of putting pineapple on pizza. The salty-sweet combination, when done right, made the best pizza known to humankind. Hell, she'd happily introduce aliens to it, if they came to visit. While the pizza was cooking, she made herself a coffee, and jotted down some notes for the media release she intended to draft today. The body had been found at the same site as that tunic Nick Fridolfsson found last year. This time it was one of the Harald Medal winners, who'd made the discovery. She thought Carl had said her name was Lauren, but it had been hard to make out. She'd have to look that up. He'd said something about a Viking weapon they'd found too, which might have belonged to the ice mummy. Then finish up with some sort of statement, wondering what stories the mummy might tell if he could talk, but with all the fancy equipment here in the lab, maybe he'll still be able to yield some interesting stories about his life and death 1,000 years ago. She still had a few minutes, so she brought her laptop back to the cafeteria and started writing while she ate her pizza. By the time she was done, including adding Jerun's name to the article, not Lauren, the last couple of pizza slices were as cold as the snow outside, so she stuck them in the microwave to reheat, while they emailed her press release to the department's PR officer, back at the main campus. Freyja wasn't the only one working on the weekend. Ingrid emailed back, saying she'd forwarded the press release to all the local media companies, and she'd come up on Monday with one of the university photographers to take some pictures. Oh, and the police would be coming too. Nothing to worry about, just standard procedure when a human body was found. Would that be convenient? Freyja's heart sank into her slippers. The last time she'd had to talk to police about a body, she'd become the headline in the following day's newspaper. This time, Freyja swallowed. Maybe having pizza for breakfast hadn't been the best idea after all. No, she swore to herself. This time would be different. This body was supposed to be here. The discovery of the century, Carl had said, and she'd believed him. Nothing would go wrong this time. She'd run standard scans on Monday morning, and by the time the police arrived, she'd have concrete evidence to prove she hadn't been anywhere near the man when he died. Hadn't even been born. Carl said the mummy was a Viking, and his hunches were usually right. He'd hired her to do his forensic work, despite knowing all about her background. In fact, he'd hired her because of it. So if he trusted her with his greatest discovery, she trusted him to know what he'd discovered. Something the police couldn't possibly arrest her for. Because this body was exactly where it was supposed to be right now, and nothing untoward was going to happen to it. 9. Odin had never seen a longhouse like it. Everything was made of stone and metal, with hardly any wood and no straw to be seen. Not even on the floors. No signs of life either. No livestock, and only 2 people, himself, and the lady who'd taken him to her bed last night. A lady who had no servants, no thralls, yet she commanded a hall so huge it would have awed even Jarl Erik. She had no need for him to hunt, for she had cold storage rooms filled with foodstuffs that ranged from jars full of fish through to rare delicacies he'd never heard of. Enough to feed an army. She owned more clothing than most people wore in a year, folded into a chest on wheels, yet there was an entire storeroom filled with more, most of it made to fit men of his size. Though he did not feel the cold, after whatever spells Erik's witch had worked on him, it was unseemly to wander around without clothing, so he took one of the stoutly woven tunics from the storeroom, only to discover that the tunic had been sewn to a pair of equally stout trousers. He had to climb into the whole ensemble from the waist, but it fit surprisingly well, like it had been made for a man of his stature. A man named Olaf, or who served someone by that name if the letters on the breast of the strange tunic were to be believed. There were countless boots too, made of a substance he took for thick, hardened leather, but he had never seen a hide like this before, all fastened together in one piece, with no stitching. It begged belief, even as he held one in his hand. Stranger still, they were made to the shape of his right foot and his left, so they fitted perfectly when he put them on. She had no need for food or hides, and water flowed from spouts throughout the building in a most miraculous manner. He'd heard tales of such things happening in cities far to the south, but to see it here, with his own eyes, this land he'd awoken in was wondrous indeed. His lady had supplies enough to last her through this winter and the next, but there was one thing she lacked, a man to protect her, and her property. Despite his failures in the past, protection he could provide. Except in all her wealth, something else was lacking, weapons. In all the chambers in her huge longhouse, he could not find so much as an axe for chopping wood, or a spear for catching fish. Most strange. Unless the warriors she intended to clothe and feed brought their own weapons with them. Odin shook his head as he continued his survey of her domain. She had several large still rooms, with metal tables and shelves full of glass bottles filled with liquids he could not identify, even when he read the labels. Not a leaf or a blossom in sight either, which was strange, though it might be because it was winter. He was no alewife or healer, so he could not be sure. Tucked between the still rooms was a scriptorium with shelves of books, but no scribe. One book lay on the vacant desk. The words on the cover read, ICELAB Maintenance Manual. Odin picked it up and thumbed through the pages. The words were far less ornate than the books he'd seen before, and much easier to read as a result. There were pictures too, but these appeared to be sketches of real things within the building, like the box on the wall with the mysteriously blinking red light. Apparently, if he pressed several of the buttons, the box would be armed. Was this why he'd found no weapons? Were the boxes weapons? Perhaps magically firing arrows or poison or releasing a plague of vipers, or... No, he would not play with things he did not yet understand. First, he would complete his survey of her domain. Then he would read the book. Then, when he knew all he could know about this place, then he would arm what defenses she had, so that he might better protect her. At last, he came to a door with a warning sign that read, Caution, outer door can be blocked by snow. Please use shovel provided. Finally, something Odin understood. He could shovel snow with the best of them. One particularly bad winter, The snow had piled up around the longhouse as high as the roof, and they'd had to dig their way out. Thor and Loki had turned it into a contest, to see who could clear a path to the outbuildings first. He'd won, of course, with Thor not far behind. Loki hadn't even reached the yard house when Thor stepped in to help him. For the first time, he wondered where they were, and why they were not here with him. Jarl Eric's witch had enchanted both of them before his eyes, while Eric promised they would rise at his command when the time came. Yet none of them were here now. A mystery to solve for another day. Right now, he had to dig his lady's longhouse out of the snow before the new storm he could see coming buried it any deeper. Odin pushed open the door, shouldering his shovel, and stepped into watery sunlight. And turned to stone. 10. If the police were paying her a visit, then she should probably make sure she hadn't left university property along the side of the road to be damaged or stolen, Freyja told herself, as she rugged up to go retrieve the scooter. One look out the front door had her swaying, and headed back to the supply room to borrow a pair of snow boots. She hadn't bothered to bring her own with her, because it was supposed to be the height of summer, with record ice melt due to global warming, hardly the time to have a snowstorm. Yet here she was, trudging through snow in her borrowed boots, determined to find and bring back that scooter before those thunderheads coming over the mountains arrived. She hadn't checked the weather forecast, but she didn't need to know the specifics to be sure those clouds looked bad. When she reached the road, she wouldn't have found the scooter if it weren't for a wheel sticking up from the snowdrift on the opposite side of the road to the one she'd flown into. Worse, the snow around it had hardened to ice overnight, so it was a bastard of a job to dig the bloody thing out. Twice, she'd considered going back to the lab for a shovel, but she wasn't sure it would be much use against the ice. Eventually, she managed to drag the ice-covered contraption onto the road, where she kicked enough frost from the tires to get them to move, so she could slowly wheel it back up the driveway. Her arms felt ready to fall off by the time she reached the end of the driveway, and turned the scooter around the corner of the building, toward the garage. Only to find that the snow was too deep to go any further. While she'd been busy with her hot Norseman last night, it must have snowed again, and all of it had been blown into the courtyard, burying the helipad, the ugly sundial, and any chance she had of leaving the lab via any mode of transport other than her own booted feet. God, and it was getting dark, with no sunlight to be seen. The clouds that had been hanging over the mountains earlier were looming over the lab now, and snowflakes were already falling. The wind had started to pick up, but they were in the lee of the building here, so the wind hadn't reached the courtyard yet. So when she saw movement, she wanted to thank every god that had ever existed. So there was a maintenance man after all. She'd never been so thankful to see a man with a shovel in all her life. "Hey you! Any chance you can help me clear a path to the garage, so I can put this away before the storm hits?" she shouted. He turned. The scooter would have dropped from her suddenly nerveless hands if the front wheel weren't firmly stuck in a snowdrift. It was him. The owner of that hot Norse cock she'd ridden half the night. Only now he was wearing overalls, and instead of those firm hands wrapped around every curve of her naked body, he was holding a shovel. She'd fucked the maintenance man? The incredibly hot, muscled beast of a maintenance man. Had he been wearing an eye patch last night, or had she been too intent on the rest of him to even notice that particular detail? She shook her head. It had been a one-night stand, a night of meaningless sex where they hadn't bothered to exchange numbers or even names. It meant nothing. Sure, one look at him and she could feel him thrusting hard between her thighs, but she could ignore that. What mattered was that she was in charge here at the lab, and he was just the maintenance man. He was here to do his job so she could do hers. Which meant she had to be professional, and in control, and pretend her underwear wasn't totally soaked at the sight of him. She fixed her gaze on his chest. On the name badge on his chest. not thinking of any of the hard muscles underneath the overalls at all. At all. Olaf, right? You're the maintenance man here. Shoveling snow, she asked. She was pretty sure he'd spoken English last night, but now she wasn't certain. Her Norwegian was limited, so if he didn't, this was going to be a whole lot harder than it had to be. Or not hard enough, her traitorous libido sniggered. Even the clouds were trying to help her, sending a flurry of flakes between them so she couldn't see him for a moment. Yeah, I shovel snow for you, he said in that same deep voice that seemed to make things vibrate deep in her core. Can you clear a path to that shed so I can put this away? She asked, pointing. I can, but there is an easier way, he said, striding through the snow as easily as if it was air. He lifted the scooter onto his shoulder, then turned and walked toward the shed. Like the bloody thing weighed nothing. She couldn't help it. She just stood and stared. Sure, the overalls hid a lot, but nothing could hide the bulge of his muscles as he carried an entire scooter across the courtyard and into the garage. When he emerged, she was still standing there, feeling stupid. Would you like me to carry you inside again too? He asked. Fuck yes. And hell no. If he lifted her in his arms again, she was totally going to take him to bed, not caring that she was his boss, and that she'd be in a whole lot of trouble if anyone found out and… Fuck, he was hot. She was surprised the snow wasn't steaming around his feet. I'll be fine, she said airily, turning away so she could head toward the front door. The snow was falling harder now, turning the drive from black to white. Even the steps were dusted with snow, and those clouds were darker than night, even if it was still mid-afternoon. She knocked the snow off her boots, then walked in her socks down the corridor past the labs to the loading dock, where the outdoor gear was supposed to be kept. She could hear the scrape of his shovel against the snow outside the loading dock door. He should come inside instead of staying out there in this storm. There was no point shoveling snow if it was only going to come down harder, as the storm worsened. He'd saved her last night, but as his boss, she was supposed to be responsible for his safety. She should open the door and tell him to come inside. She was not going to do anything inappropriate when he came in. She could control herself. Freyja punched the button to open the loading dock door. Wind howled into the building, showering her in snow. She coughed and spluttered for a moment before she cupped her hands to her mouth and shouted, "You need to come inside, out of the storm. It's not safe out there." A rumbling laugh came out of the darkness. "I will be fine. I will come inside when I am finished." Sleeping with one of her staff was bad enough, but letting him get injured because of her own silliness was way worse. He'd only been wearing overalls. Not even proper snow gear. If he stayed out there much longer, he might freeze to death. And that would be a terrible loss to the world. Even if she could never share a bed with him again. I must insist. The university safety procedures state that everyone has to take shelter inside during a snowstorm. They even extended the accommodation block, so that a whole expedition team could stay here in case of bad weather. Oh God. He'd have to sleep here another night. She wasn't going to sleep a wink. I must insist you come inside. I am almost finished. Once I am done, then I shall come inside, and not before. The shovel scraped again, but she couldn't see him amid the whirling snow outside. It looked like a freaking blizzard out there. What kind of lunatic insisted on shoveling snow in a blizzard? Get inside now, she ordered, with the voice of a doctor dealing with life or death. This? It's Freyja. Dr. Freyja Valdis, actually, but as we tend to keep things pretty informal at the university, Freyja will be fine. He appeared at the door, looming larger than she remembered. His eye gleamed blue like the summer sky should have been, as he dusted snow out of his golden hair. As you command, Dr. Freyja, I am coming inside with you now." He grinned, as if he knew exactly how his words sounded. And then his grin disappeared as all the lights went out. "Fuck," she said, spitting out another mouthful of snow. She needed to get the door shut, and that wasn't happening without electricity. "Go get the power back on, and then come right back so I can close this door." 11. Odin nodded and turned back to the storm. He had no idea how to do what she'd ordered him to do, but she'd pointed up at the roof, and he vaguely remembered a picture in the manual showing a ladder to the roof, which he could just make out through the swirling snow. What he'd do once he reached the roof he wasn't sure, but if that's what she wanted, he shrugged and headed up. Snow had piled up on the roof as well, which was topped by strange black glass tiles, each one as big as a bed. The tiles were pitched at a sharp enough angle that the snow slid right off, but it was coming down thick and fast now, so it was only a matter of time before the piles rose high enough to topple over onto the tiles, and cover those as well. An angry squawk made him peer under the nearest tile, and almost lose his good eye to a well-aimed beak. Odin backed away from the raven and its nest. No, 2 ravens, with nestlings beneath them. He'd always had a soft spot for ravens, so he took a moment to shape the snow into a barrier that blocked the nest from the worst of the storm. "I'll bring you some food later. The gods know we have enough to spare," he promised the birds. He scanned the roof again. There was no sign of any threat, or anything else he could do, so he grabbed the side rails of the ladder and began to descend. "Good work. The lights are back on, so get in here now and help me shut this door," he heard her say faintly over the wind. Odin grinned and obeyed. 12. She did her best to avoid him for the rest of the evening. When he entered the cafeteria, she grabbed her things and left, making sure to keep her bedroom door closed, so she definitely didn't know which of the guest rooms he'd chosen, which meant she couldn't possibly knock on his door in the middle of the night, no matter how tempting that might be. She even went to bed early in the hope that she could fall asleep and not think about him for a few hours, but sleep refused to come. Instead, all she could think about was the previous night. How amazing he'd looked naked. How his hot, hard length had driven her to undreamt of peaks of pleasure, and how she'd wanted to do it all again when she woke up this morning. No, afternoon. The one-eyed monster of a maintenance man. No, his eye, not his monstrous. Fuck. She'd never been this needy in her life, but if there was one thing she knew well, it was anatomy, so she pleasured herself as best she could, trying not to think about how much better it would be if it were his huge hands doing this and not her own, before she finally dropped off to sleep. Only to wake in the dark, absolutely fucking freezing. She reached for the light, but that wasn't working either. She swore. The power had gone out again. Which meant she had to do the one thing she'd sworn she wouldn't, go and tell Olaf the maintenance man that she needed him. She fumbled for the torch she'd left on her bedside table, as insurance against another blackout. It had to be Olaf's fault, she fumed as she pulled on a coat over her pajamas. He hadn't fixed the power properly, which was why it had gone out again. She headed up the corridor, checking every guest room, before sweeping her torch beam around the bunk room. No Olaf. Maybe she'd underestimated him, and he was already working on the problem. Freyja found him in the cafeteria, reading a book. Under cafeteria lights that worked just fine. She blew out a frustrated breath that no longer misted the air. The heating was working in here, too. It wasn't all that warm, but it was better than nothing. The power's out in the accommodation block. Can you fix it? She asked. He glanced up. I am not sure. I am not familiar with these electrical systems. I am trying to learn about them. Do you know much about this backup system? The hospitals back home had backup generators to keep the power on in a blackout. Only the backup generator didn't power the entire building, just the essential systems, including life support, which was why you had to check what you plugged the machines into, to make sure the socket was connected to the backup system. If things work the same way here. Backup systems are usually only connected to the most essential things, she said slowly. But what were the most essential things here? Keeping the artifact safe, or stopping the staff from freezing to death? A little bit of cold air wouldn't hurt the artifacts, which had all survived centuries buried in ice, but humans were a whole lot more fragile. Surely the university hadn't. Let me see that, she ordered, grabbing the book from Olaf. She flipped to the pages on the backup system. Luckily, this was the English manual and not the Norwegian one, so she could mostly make sense of it. Essential systems were, everything in the main lab building, but not the accommodation annex. So the cafeteria had heat, light, and an operational kitchen, and the ice mummy in the basement got to continue defrosting at a nice constant temperature, but unless she wanted to freeze to death like he had, she'd have to find somewhere else to sleep. In a lab or the cafeteria or the library. The labs were out because the doors all had electronic locks, which might not be working properly after the power outage, and no way did she want to get trapped in one of those, without food or a bathroom. The cafeteria could work, for there was plenty of space, easy access to food and water, with bathrooms right outside. The only problem was that she'd have to wrestle a mattress up 2 flights of narrow stairs before she could sleep there, and her arms still ached from dragging the scooter back. But the library was on the same level as the guest rooms, plus it was a whole lot more private than the cafeteria. He might not be responsible for her frigid room, but he could have at least warned her that it might happen when he turned the backup system on. So it was still partially his problem, and he could bloody well help her fix it, at least for tonight. She handed the book back to Olaf. It looks like we're on backup power, which only works in this part of the building. Until mains power is restored, we'll have to sleep here in the lab building instead of the guest rooms. Can you help me drag a mattress into the library? He set the book down on the table. Of course. It took 2 of them to wrestle her mattress down the narrow corridors and into the library, which got its name from the shelves lining one wall, filled with a mixture of academic texts and tattered novels. She let go, and the mattress thumped to the floor, taking up most of the available space. I will help you carry the bedding, Olaf said, leaving. It wasn't until she'd finished making up the bed, with pillows and linen, and a couple of extra blankets she'd found in the cupboard, that she realized there was no space for another mattress for Olaf, who had already begun stripping out of his overalls. Holy fuck. She'd noticed his muscles before, but now she looked at him, really looked at him. She needed to keep her hands off him. Even if they had to share a bed, and he was going to be doing it. Gulp. Naked. No funny business. Keep your hands to yourself, she said. We're only sharing a bed to keep warm. That's it. Hopefully the power will be back on tomorrow, and we can go back to normal sleeping arrangements. Olaf nodded. As you wish. Well, if he could sound that professional and disinterested, like last night's sex had been nothing out of the ordinary for him, so could she. Good night, she said, climbing under the covers and turning her back to him. If she didn't look, then she wouldn't be tempted to do something she shouldn't. Sleep well, Dr. Freyja, he replied as he slid in beside her. At first she couldn't sleep, hearing his every breath and wondering if he was going to say something. Or do something. The next thing she knew, she was pressed against something hot and hard and her hands were wrapped around. Fuck. She rolled over, put her back to him, and stuck her hands firmly under her pillow, glad he couldn't see her blush burning in the dark. An hour later, she woke up again. This time, she hooked her leg over his and was all but dry humping him. She jerked away. Dr. Freyja, is there something you wish to ask me? His voice rumbled out of the darkness. Fuck. She had woken him up. No. Just, we're only sharing a bed to keep each other warm, right? Nothing else. She heard him shift, then felt the mattress move as he rose. Then the door opened and closed, and he was gone. She let out a long breath she hadn't known she was holding. Fuck. 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 13. He could sleep beside a woman, even snuggle up to her for warmth, and not put a finger past propriety. He'd done it for years with Frigg, who he knew had no wish for his body in any romantic sense. But Freyja, whose hands caressed and stroked, who'd even pressed her wet center against him as she'd started to climb on top of him, now she was driving him well into the realms of madness, for she obviously wanted him as much as he wanted her. That's when he remembered the little sheaths from last night, the ones she'd said would keep them safe from little surprises. He'd seen a box of them in one of the storerooms during his explorations earlier, so he left to get some. Her breathing was still rapid and uneven when he opened the door to the scriptorium, so he knew she wasn't asleep. He tossed the square packages onto the bed. All except for one, which he opened so he might sheath himself with the sticky casing inside. Then he lay beside her on the bed, ready for her. Dr. Freyja, you may safely mount me now, he said, when she did not immediately do so. I can what? You were trying to climb on top of me before. I am now wearing one of your condoms, and I am ready for you. To keep you warm, like you want. I don't, she spluttered. Dr. Freyja, you are wet for me just like last night. I am just as ready for you. For all the fucking you want. He reached for her hand and wrapped it around his sheathed cock. He half expected her to yank her hand away as she had before, but this time she did not. You really are huge, aren't you? Odin smiled in the dark. But you can take me. She squirmed beneath the blankets beside him. Taking off her clothing? He hoped so. A moment later, she and the blankets shifted to cover him. This is just to keep warm, he heard her say. Then she eased herself down upon his length, and began to ride him. Tentatively at first, then harder and faster, so he took hold of her hips and matched her thrust for thrust, until she was gasping, moaning, then screaming his name, or the name she'd called him. He still hadn't bothered to correct her, not once, but over and over, until he thought she was spent. Are you warm enough now? He asked, ready to help her lie down beside him. I want more, she said. So he flipped her over instead, covering her body with his, but he didn't enter her again just yet. Tell me you want me, he said. Frigg would never have said the words. But Freyja, she hesitated. We're just keeping warm, she said weakly. He pressed the tip of his cock against her folds, rubbing that sensitive spot so she gasped. Tell me what you want, he said. He knew what he wanted, to fuck her all night, and protect her every other moment he wasn't in her bed. But this was about her. She swallowed. I want you to fuck me. Hot and hard like last night. He tried to take it slow, but the glorious tightness as she closed around him drove him wild. He pounded into her as she cried and begged for more, until he roared her name at the peak of his own pleasure, then fucked her some more. 14. When Freyja's breathing slowed into sleep, he carefully withdrew and went outside to check on the storm. The blizzard still raged, so he headed back inside, hoping that by reading the maintenance manual, he might learn enough about this building to keep her warm without a fire. For he could not fuck her every moment of the day and night, no matter how much he wanted to. It was nearly morning too. He should take his book for a walk around the building, matching the sections to the equipment they explained, until he actually understood it all. Freyja would forgive him for not warming her all night. If he found a way to warm the whole building once more, he was sure of it. And he needed to take the ravens some food, before he forgot to, and hope they survived the blizzard. He'd promised, after all. 15. The second afternoon in a row, Freyja woke up alone. This time, she was definitely aching for him. She'd never liked rough sex before, but with him, he could pound her all night and she'd still beg for more. Or climb on top of him and ride him. God, she could barely believe she'd done that last night. He was her subordinate, for fuck's sake. A sexual harassment case just waiting to happen. Unless they could just forget about it, and pretend it hadn't happened. After all, the first night hadn't meant anything to him, so the second probably hadn't either. The power would be back on by now, so they wouldn't have to share a room again, let alone a bed, or huddle together for warmth. She shook herself. The last thing she should be thinking about right now was hot sex, especially after she'd had so much of it. What she should be doing was taking a look at how well the body in the necropsy fridge was defrosting, to see whether she could at least X-ray it, before the police arrived tomorrow. Because everything would go so much more smoothly tomorrow if she could confidently say Carl and Joran had found a Viking, instead of some modern-day murder victim. Well, they still might have been murdered, just far enough in the past that the killer was likely to be just as dead as their victim. Just as long as the police left without arresting her. Was that too much to ask? She'd also like it if they kept her name out of the news, but if this body really was the find of the century, like Carl said, because Otzi the Iceman was so last century, news headlines were probably inevitable. And if her name was in the news for a good reason, linked with an incredible discovery, that could only be a good thing, right? She stopped off in her, still freezing guest room to get her camera, so she could get some good preliminary shots of the ice mummy. The university had several of them in the supply room, and one mounted on a set of scaffolding up on the ceiling of the scanner room, but she always felt more comfortable with her own equipment. Besides, if any of the pictures from the university cameras got wiped because of the power outage, at least she'd have the ones she'd taken. She knew Carl took backups when he was out at site for the same reason. They'd even taken extra solar panels to charge all the equipment this trip. Freyja shook her head. She'd never get used to the idea of solar panels in the snow. Or snow at all, really. Thinking about snow, how bad was the blizzard last night? Surely it had stopped snowing by now. Freyja peeked through the glass front door and was surprised to see nothing really. Everything was white. Usually, you could see the curve of the driveway and the road in the distance, with the village up on the next hill, but she might as well have been in Antarctica for all she could see now. There was snow piled up as high as the steps, with a drift even covering most of the doormat. And there were snowflakes still floating down from a sky that was almost as dark as yesterday, when she'd ordered Olaf inside. She hoped he wasn't out there shoveling snow again. They'd need earth-moving equipment to shift this load, or a week of proper summer weather, because one man's muscles and a shovel just wouldn't cut it. But she wasn't supposed to be thinking about Olaf right now. All of her focus should be on the ice mummy, and what she might discover. She forced herself to head for the necropsy lab, no matter how much she wanted a coffee, because she'd learned the hard way that it was best to deal with dead bodies before breakfast. She scanned her security card at the door, and breathed a sigh of relief that the electronic locks were still working. Not that anyone would want to break into this lab to steal stuff, but there were valuable artifacts in the climate-controlled artifact rooms, like coins and jewelry and things, which would probably fetch a high price on the illegal antiquities market. Or so she imagined, seeing as she knew nothing about illegal markets at all, but the legal market, which seemed to be a kind of catfight between museums as far as she could tell, were already salivating over the finds, and competing to design an exhibit worthy of displaying them. She hoped whoever got the ice mummy would be willing to show them to the world. Some discoveries needed to be shared, and not hidden away. Whoever the mummy had been in life was nothing compared to how famous they'd be in death. If Carl was right. Freyja reached for the door handle to the walk-in refrigerator. She took a deep breath, then prayed silently that this discovery would change her life for the better. She wasn't even sure who or what she directed the prayer to, as she wasn't the least bit religious. Maybe the Judeo-Christian God, or the Norse pantheon that the mummy had believed in. Who had the leader of the Norse gods been again? She considered reaching for her phone to check, before she remembered, it was Odin, the one they called the All-Father. Not because he screwed anything that moved like Zeus, but because he was considered the guy responsible for creation, or so Lara had told her one night at the end of last season, after a lot of aquavit. "Odin, I could do with a bit of your favor right now," she said as she yanked down the handle and threw the door open. "Fuck me," she breathed at what she saw. The autopsy table sat in the middle of the fridge, just where she'd left it, awash with water, but the body was gone. "Odin, you are an asshole," she snapped as she slammed the door. 16. Freyja could see the headlines already. It'd be the body thief strikes again everywhere, from here to home, never mind that she'd never stolen a single body, let alone this one. The media hadn't cared about destroying her life and livelihood last time. All they'd cared about was getting more traffic to their websites with their horrible clickbait headlines, and this time would be no different. And with the police coming tomorrow, they'd arrest her for sure. Even worse was how devastated Carl would be, having finally found his holy grail, only for it to go missing. Getting arrested would almost be a relief if it meant she wouldn't see Carl's face when he found out the body was missing. Unless she could find the body before the police arrived. If she could, then no one need ever know it had gone missing. Only it could be anywhere by now. If someone had stolen it while she'd been on that video call to her family, before her attempt to pick up at the pub, they could be anywhere within a 2-day drive. They could be anywhere in Europe by now, if they hadn't put the body on a plane, in which case it could be absolutely anywhere. Except, she hadn't seen tire tracks in the snow when she'd taken the scooter out, which was why she hadn't seen the ice patch until she hit it. Nor had there been any tire tracks when she'd wheeled the scooter back from the crash site yesterday, and then the blizzard had hit, and no one with any sense would have been out in that. Even now, the roads were impassable, and there was no way a helicopter could have landed in the courtyard without her noticing. Which meant the body had to still be on the premises. Hidden somewhere. Either in cold storage, or in a box big enough to keep it cool until they could transport it to a buyer. She couldn't miss something that big, and whoever had hidden it had likely used a trolley to take it to its hiding place, so she could probably limit her search to anywhere you could take a trolley. But not the mortuary trolley, because they'd left that in the fridge. Which was weird, really. Why wouldn't you take the trolley it was already on? Unless the new trolley was the way they intended to transport it off-site, when the roads were clear. So she was probably looking for something big, with wheels. After all, it wasn't like the body had gotten up and hidden itself. That thing had been dead for at least 1,000 years. Mummies didn't move except in really weird movies, and she definitely wasn't in one of those. She was far too practical for that sort of thing. She marched out to start her search. 17. It wasn't until Freyja was finished checking the fridges and freezers in the kitchen that she realized she hadn't actually had breakfast yet. So while she waited for another frozen pizza to cook, she paced across the cafeteria, trying to work out where she hadn't looked yet. Because wherever it was, that's where the body had to be. As she chewed thoughtfully on a slice of pizza, she mused on where she'd hide a body, if she really was a body thief. Somewhere it wouldn't be found, obviously. Somewhere no one else would go. Well, no one would be crazy enough to go outside in this weather, that was for sure. But if they'd stolen the body as soon as it had arrived, before the storm started, maybe. Swaying, she headed down to the loading dock, where she'd left her snow gear. Crossing the snow-filled courtyard provoked even more swaying, but she had to be sure. One by one, she trudged to each of the outbuildings and checked those. One shed held the waste barrels, which she left well alone. The body was too big to fit in one of those, unless someone cut it up, and what was the point of that? The ice mummy was important because it was intact. Unless it really was a modern murder victim. No. No one went out to the Jotunheimen Mountains for anything except hiking or an archaeological dig, and if someone had gone missing out there, she'd have seen something about it. This was Carl's ice mummy. The body wouldn't be in a barrel. Gardening tools, hazardous chemicals, more shovels, a whole lot of salt and something that looked like a cross between a lawnmower and a mulching machine, which she figured must be a snowblower or something, seeing as it had SNO written on the side. Just like inside the main building, there were no bodies here either. Not that she really expected there to be. She'd struggled to reach the other side of the courtyard, just by herself. Carrying something huge like a corpse, no, it just wasn't possible. Her traitorous memory popped up an image of Olaf, his muscles bulging through his overalls as he lifted the scooter like it was weightless, striding through the snow with effortless ease. He could have done it. Not just on Friday, but any time since the helicopter had landed. After all, she'd slept late yesterday and today, and who else was here but the two of them? They were snowed in, for Odin's sake. If she wasn't the body thief, then he had to be. Now, if she was a massive Norse muscle man who wanted to steal the body of one of his ancestors, where would she put it? Somewhere she'd never look and never reach, but also where it would be easy to transport. Had he taken the scooter to the garage not just to be nice, but to keep her from finding the body? If he had, she was going to kick him in that massive groin of his. It was a big enough target. She marched to the garage and kicked at the door until the ice freezing it shut fell away, then threw the door open. It was half full of cars, most belonging to the expedition crew, all with the keys inside, in case anyone needed to move them while the owners were out at the site. A quick scan of the garage told her the body wasn't in sight, so she tried the cars next. Opening all the doors and the boot of each one, only to come up empty. Damn it, where was it? She would have put it in the back of a car, for easy transport. The garage was easily as cold as the mortuary fridge, so it wasn't like keeping it cold would be an issue. It could stay out here until the snow melted, if it was here. Which it wasn't. Which left where? She stomped outside, slamming the garage door behind her. She'd looked everywhere. Tramped all over snow that shouldn't be here in summer. And she still hadn't found the bloody body. If Olaf was watching her, she'd bet he was laughing his ass off. She could almost imagine him standing there in the courtyard, snow shovel in hand, massive muscled shoulders shaking as he hid his mirth behind one huge hand. Fuck, was that really the answer? So fucking simple, she hadn't even thought of it. Because why would any sane person go out in a snowstorm, unless they were burying a body in the snow? Freyja seized a shovel and began to dig. 18. Odin waited until it was dark enough to venture outside, before heading up to the roof to check on the ravens. The snowfall had faded to just a few flakes at a time, and he was surprised to find the ravens, parents and babies, had weathered the storm quite well, and while they were initially hostile, they soon calmed down when he laid out the table scraps from Freyja's last meal. He did notice that the black tiles were now covered with snow, which the maintenance manual said was not a good thing. He wanted to ask Freyja's advice on the correct course of action first though, for she was surely more familiar with these magical power systems than he was. All the knowledge he had came from a few pictures in a book, The temperature was definitely dropping, with more snow on the way, so he should find her sooner rather than later, to make sure the work was finished before the next wave of this storm hit. He was just about to descend into the building again to search for Freyja, when he noticed movement on the ground. What in the God's name? He headed down to the courtyard instead. What are you doing? She huffed out a breath and set down her shovel. I'm looking for the missing body, only I haven't found it yet, which is why I'm still digging. Care to enlighten me, or are you just going to try to distract me with your dick again? Frigg had said and done many puzzling things in their time together, but Freyja made him feel like a witless fool. She evidently knew it too, for she grabbed his arm like he was a wayward toddler. Come with me and I'll show you. She took him to a room with metal tables, then stopped outside the door. This is where I put the ice mummy to defrost on Friday. This is where it still should be, except it isn't. She patted her pockets, then scowled. I left my security pass down in the loading bay. You'll have to open the door. Obediently, Odin grabbed the handle, but it did not budge. I do not believe I can. Unless she wanted him to break the door, which he suspected he could, but then he would have to repair it, and he did not know nearly enough about working glass or metal to do that. She swore. Fine, I'll go get mine. You stay right here and don't move until I get back. She stormed off before he could mention the possible power problems. She returned soon enough with a small palm-sized rectangle that she swiped across a box with a blinking light, which went from red to green. Now she could turn the door handle with no effort at all. He wouldn't mind a magic card like that. Where do I get such a card? He asked. She frowned. The university issues them pretty much the day you start, because you can't access most of the staff areas without one. Out here though, maybe yours is still in the post. I guess I could take a look in the office, in case it's already arrived, but no one thought to open it. She shook her head. But that's not important. What is important is what's supposed to be here and isn't. She strode into the room, then yanked open a second door that led to a cold storage chamber. What do you see that's wrong with this picture? She waved at the interior as mist curled around her boots. Odin looked inside. There is very little here. A lot of empty shelves, and a table on wheels with a tub full of water. He stepped inside and peered into the tub. Just a short hunting spear. He pulled it out of the water, the weight achingly familiar in his hand. He'd set this spear in Loki's hand, the day his family had died. He would have done the same for Vali and Vidar, when they were old enough. But now the only hand left to hold it was his. Freyja blinked. I didn't see that before. It must have been frozen in the ice with the body. The one that isn't here. Do you know where it is? From the fury in her expression, she evidently expected him to be able to answer her. But Odin could only shake his head. You are looking for a man's body? One that you believe should be here? His first thought was Loki, the most likely man to wield Odin's spear, for Thor favored his father's hammer, unwieldy though it was. But Loki would have only feigned death, and the moment no one was watching, shifted into a smaller, swifter creature so he could flee. Then he would return later, with information to help everyone. That was why he was the best scout they'd ever had. Where is it, Olaf? I do not know. I had no idea you kept a corpse in here. The only things I have seen in the cold storage chambers are food supplies. Who would steal a body, yet leave such a valuable spear behind? She held out her hand. Let me see that. She peered closely at the carvings, then dropped it back onto the table, beside the water-filled tub. I just know those are Viking runes. Carl or one of the others will know what it means. Interesting. Freyja could read the maintenance manual well enough, so it had not occurred to him that she could not read this as well. This is a hunting blessing, invoking the god's favor for it to fly straight and true, Odin said, pointing at the first line of runes. These are the names of the men who have wielded it, in a direct line from father to son. The last name was his own, carved by his father on the night he'd become a man. He'd never had a chance to decide which of his sons would wield it after him. Now he never would. Only a fool would leave this behind. He'd left it behind the night Frigg died. She'd fought with it to protect their sons and herself, but it had not been enough. Freyja sighed as if she shared his pain. Yeah, well, we should leave it here for now, where it'll be safe. Or as safe as anything can be, with people stealing bodies. She led the way out into the corridor, and Odin followed. The door had just clicked closed before the lights blinked out. Fuck. Not again, Freyja said. Odin coughed. I forgot. I was supposed to tell you that the backup power comes from the black solar panels on the roof, charging a battery, and the storm covered them with snow, so we will need to clear the snow off them if we want more power. She huffed out a breath. You have got to be the worst maintenance man I ever met. 19. Why he couldn't have told her about the solar panels when it was still daylight, she didn't know. Or why he hadn't just gone and cleaned the bloody things himself without waiting for, what? Her permission to do his fucking job? Even in the dark, he could evidently feel her fury. I intended to tell you earlier, only you were digging in the snow, and then you brought me up here as this seemed more urgent, and... He coughed. I am not familiar with solar panels, so I hope you can help. She'd bloody well have to, wouldn't she? Not like she could trust Olaf to get it right. First stealing stuff and now this. What kind of maintenance man was he anyway? One who didn't have access to the necropsy lab, or the fridge, her traitorous subconscious whispered. Which kind of meant he couldn't possibly have stolen the body. And she'd seen the way he looked at that spear. Like he'd wanted it, but he'd set it down without a backward glance. But if he hadn't stolen the body, and she knew she hadn't, who had? And where was it? Freyja shook her head. In the dark, facing a night with no power, she had bigger things to worry about. She could worry about the corpse in the morning when the power came back on. She'd left her torch in the library, but she still had her phone, and the flashlight app that would shine the way until the battery on that died at least. Let's get a couple of lanterns from the supply room, and head up to the roof. The sooner we get this done the better, she said. At the base of the stairs to the roof, there were a bunch of brooms, all labeled for solar panels only. So that was how you dealt with solar panels and snow. She grabbed 2 brooms and handed one to Olaf. Somehow he'd already acquired a shovel, and Freyja wasn't going to argue. She'd had enough shoveling snow today to last her for 2 lifetimes at least. Sweeping the snow off the solar panels was kind of cathartic, actually. She was still pissed off that the mummy was missing, still fuming that the power was out and the man on the roof with her was responsible for it being out until at least morning, but at least she could do something about it. Well, that wasn't hitting him with the broom. Tempting though that was, it wouldn't make anything better. She'd probably only miss him and hit one of the solar panels instead, anyway. She finished clearing one panel, but it was a hard slog through semi-frozen snow to get to the next one, especially as it was up past her waist. But they had to clear the snow off all the panels, or there'd be no power tomorrow. Olaf set down his broom. You keep cleaning the panels. I will shovel snow. But you can't use the shovel. It'll scratch the panels, she began, then closed her mouth. He most certainly could use the shovel, scooping up big piles of snow and sending them tumbling down to the ground below. One after the other, in an avalanche that would bury anyone unlucky enough to be standing in the courtyard. Burying all her work from this afternoon too, if he had hidden the body out there. which even she was finding hard to believe. Sure, she hadn't stolen it, and he was the only other person here, but her gut told her he wasn't a body thief either. Or maybe that was her core, getting so excited about his cock it didn't care what else he might be capable of. Like clearing the roof of snow, so by the time she had to head to the next panel, she could actually see the roof panels beneath her feet. Halfway along, she was definitely flagging. She should never have tried to dig up the whole courtyard, no matter what she suspected was hidden there. But he was still going strong, not slowing in the slightest. If anything, he seemed to be moving faster, already clearing around the base of the panel 3 ahead of her. She swiped at the next panel with her broom, and lost her grip on the handle. The broom went flying, sending a gobbet of snow soaring across the roof to splat against Olaf's back. Shit. She might have fantasized about whacking him, but that had been a complete accident. She waited for him to turn around, so she could apologize. Only he didn't even seem to have noticed. Maybe it hadn't hit him that hard, or he was just more used to the cold, being a native Norwegian and all. Or maybe he was enjoying his snow shoveling so much, he hadn't even noticed. She retrieved her broom, and swept a load of snow down to where she could reach it. Then she scooped up a double handful, and began to shape it into a ball. Yes, it was childish. No, she probably shouldn't do this. But it was better than hitting him with a broom, for being so frustrating and hot all at the same time. She drew her arm back and let fly with the snowball. It soared right over his head and smashed on the next solar panel. Now who was useless? He turned. Dr. Freyja? Are you all right? No. I was trying to hit you, she admitted. He nodded. You need to aim better. He shaped his own snowball, but instead of throwing it at her, he lobbed it into the courtyard, right at that stupid sundial sticking out of the snow. Of course he hit his target, which thrummed like a gong at the blow. I can teach you, he said. She grabbed another handful of snow. I don't need help throwing things. This one skimmed his shoulder, then careened off into the darkness. He just grinned. Yes, you do. Would you believe I stunned a reindeer with a snowball once? I hit it right between the eyes and it just keeled over, right in front of me on the snow. When it woke up, I taught it to pull my sled. That is complete bullshit, I bet, she declared. Olaf held up both hands. It is the truth, I swear. She considered for a moment. She knew there were reindeer herders in the mountains, and she'd analyzed enough dead reindeer for Carl and his team here in the lab. If Olaf was from around here, maybe even living with the herders, he might not be lying. I suppose you called it Rudolph then, she said, setting her hands on her hips. No, I called her Devoran. It means sleep, he said. This time, she actually believed him. He might not be much of a maintenance man, but he was a champion snow shoveler and a reindeer trainer. I've never seen a real, live reindeer. Only pictures of them, and the remains that come in from the mountains, she admitted. Well, it is no wonder if you cannot hit your target. You will frighten them away, Olaf said. He went back to shoveling. Reluctantly, she retrieved her broom and went to work on the next panel. After a moment she said, You know, there aren't any reindeer where I'm from. No snow either. Then what are you doing so far from home? You mean, when I'm not clearing snow and searching for missing bodies? She considered for a moment. Maybe running away from my failures, or at least the people who remind me of them, all the time. What I could have had if things hadn't gone so wrong. Working out what I can have, now all that I wanted is gone. Before she could say anything else, she went back to work, scrubbing fiercely at the panel surface to get the ice off. Then you are very brave to come so far and try new things, when you have lost so much. She blinked. Now he was complimenting her. I'm not brave. I'm a coward, running from things instead of facing them. Not that there's anything left to face anymore, even if I wanted to. Sometimes you need to run. Sometimes running away, sometimes running toward things. Life is not about standing still. He dumped the last load of snow of the roof, and began sweeping the last solar panel. What would you do if I threw a snowball at you? He wouldn't miss, that was for sure. I'd lob one right back, she said. Yet I am bigger than you, with better aim. This is a fight you cannot win, he said. He was already on to the next panel. He even swept faster than she did. Depends on what you mean by winning. I'd consider one good hit to the face or the groin a win, she said. She swallowed. God, what was she saying? She was his boss. She wasn't supposed to hurt him. There were laws about these things. So you would continue to fight an opponent, no matter what the outcome? That is both stubborn and brave. Very Viking traits. You are well suited to life here. Freyja burst out laughing. Yeah, if it wasn't for all the snow. She looked up, to find he'd cleaned off the last panel. They were finished. Yet, she didn't want to go inside yet. She eyed the remaining pile of snow at her feet. Hey Olaf, do you want to build a snowman? 20. They build 3 snowmen, at the farthest corner of the roof from the Raven family, for Odin had left their snowdrift shelter untouched. Freyja found leaves and sticks to give the men faces, and Odin was struck with the memory of the last time he'd made men out of snow. It was the last night he'd seen his sons alive. Vali had been bitter, slinking off to sulk when Odin refused to take the boy raiding with him. Vidar, the more persuasive of the two, had tried to get him to stay home instead of leading his men. Odin had suggested they build Vidar his own army of snowmen, to defend them while he was gone. He'd given them faces and weapons and even armor made of sticks and leaves, and they'd still been standing, surrounding the house, when he'd arrived home. But they'd been poor defenders, because his family had not survived the attack. Odin fell to his knees, nearly toppling the last snowman, which was the same height Vidar had been when he'd last seen him. Round as a ball in his winter clothes, just like the snowman. Oh, by all the gods, if he'd loved Frigg more, would he have stayed? Would he have been able to save them? A hand landed lightly on his shoulder. Olaf. Are you all right? What must she think of him? Some protector, sniffling and weeping in the snow. I was thinking of the last time I saw my son. When we built snowmen together. Her voice was dull flat. I'm so sorry for your loss. Her arms came around him, hugging him, heedless of his tears or his weakness. Offering her own strength. Something no one had ever offered him before. He fell in love with her all over again. 21. Snow started to fall in earnest, bringing Freyja to her senses. What the hell was she doing hugging Olaf on the roof? She'd lost count of the times she'd counseled grieving or soon-to-be grieving families in hospital, but not once had she ever been unprofessional enough to hug someone. Okay, most of the time they'd looked like they wanted to strangle her for being the bearer of bad news, which had made it easier, and she hadn't slept with any of her patients' families like she had with Olaf, but… Oh God, if he'd had a son, that probably meant he had a wife too. Which made their nights of hot sex even worse. Freyja mumbled something about going inside, and quickly moved away from Olaf, back into the relative warmth of the building. Warmth that would dissipate quickly until the power kicked back in, or sunlight hit the solar panels in the morning. She and Olaf would just have to snuggle up for another night together. And if it was anything like the last 2 nights… Her cheeks burned at the thought. No. She was not getting naked with Olaf again. The first night, she hadn't known who he was, so it was kind of excusable, but last night was never to be repeated. Ever. She'd left the lanterns on the roof, so she used her phone flashlight to guide her to the kitchen. The pizza had been hours ago, and it was probably dinner time by now. With no power, she'd have to scrounge for something in the storerooms that didn't need cooking. She vaguely remembered seeing jars of pickled herring and tins of sardines, neither of which appealed to her. Maybe she should just go for some liquid bread, she thought, reaching into one of the beer cartons. That's what ancient people had called beer, hadn't they? Instead of cans though, her hand closed around something plastic and crackly, a bag of barbecue-flavored chips. Beer and chips then, she decided, digging around until she found a can as well. She took her plunder back to the cafeteria, which was now lit by the lanterns Olaf had brought down from the roof. He just sat there, his arms folded on the table, looking at her. She should have thought to grab him a beer, too. There's more beer in the storeroom. Proper food too, though most of the stuff that doesn't need to be cooked is fish. Olaf shook his head. I am not hungry. Freyja didn't think she was either, but she opened the chips and popped a couple in her mouth, just to stop herself from saying something stupid. Then she cracked open her beer, taking a long pull from the can, before setting it down firmly on the table. God, that stuff was awful. Worse than some of the stuff she'd drunk as a student back home. She'd preferred fruity premixes back then, but the last time she'd had one of them was Halloween, the holiday she now hated more than any other day on the calendar. She should tell him. He told her about losing his son, so she should tell him her whole sordid story. What she was really running away from, though she'd since learned there was nowhere in the world she could run to where they didn't know or wouldn't find out. Better than Olaf heard it from her than Saint Nick, though he was in hospital, wasn't he? He'd be out soon enough, and seeing as he was the one who'd told everyone else on campus, he'd probably get a kick out of telling Olaf too. I used to be a doctor. Well, I finished my degree and my internship, and I was well into my residency at a big city hospital. I hadn't decided what I wanted to specialize in. I was leaning toward emergency medicine, but my dad kept telling me I should become an anesthetist, because the demand was so high for them, and putting people to sleep had to be way easier than triage when everything's crazy and happening at once. She couldn't help smiling a little at the memory. That was what she'd liked most about medicine. Not all the study and memorizing stuff, but the way her mind would go calm in all the chaos, and she could make split-second decisions and know she'd made the right call. Calls she would never make again, because of him. Anyway, I was on rotation in the oncology ward. I absolutely hated it there, because for every person who'd had their tumor or whatever successfully removed, there were half a dozen others who weren't so lucky. People whose lives were suddenly cut short by a random cell abnormality that just wouldn't die. We'd fight them in every way possible, with every weapon modern medicine could provide, even nuclear ones, and it still wasn't enough. Cancer is like cockroaches, I swear. Just when you think you've killed it, a dozen more pop up, livelier than ever, while the poor person knows they're going to die. And when you're the doctor, you have to tell them. You have to give them the bad news, that they're not going to make it. That you can't work miracles or magic, and they're going to die. Some people were really good at it. Some even made a career out of hospice medicine. Once girl I knew, this calm, serene sort of person you just knew was some sort of saint, told me you had to think of it as end-of-life care. Just like newborns had midwives to usher them screaming into this world, some people needed someone to be there to usher them out of it with as much dignity and kindness as they deserved. And they do, and I know she's right, and I hope she's still doing a fucking amazing job with her terminal patients, and that she can do it for a really long time, but that wasn't me. Death was like the ultimate failure to me. Patients would come to hospital for help, and I felt like such a fucking failure if I couldn't help them. It was even worse when we got kids or young people. People the same age as me, looking at the pointy end of death when they should have decades of life ahead of them. The parents were worse. They looked like zombies, desperate for a miracle they knew couldn't come, utterly horrified that they were going to outlive their kids. Which shouldn't happen, you know. Olaf nodded gravely. Right. He did know. Better than anyone. Anyway, that year, Halloween was on the weekend, and my roommate decided she wanted to throw a party. She'd been assigned to the maternity ward, but we both managed to get our rosters to match so we'd be free that night. She did a lot of night shifts, so she finished before I did, and she came to remind me about the party. I was doing my final rounds of my patients for the shift, dragging my feet a bit, and she caught me in the room of a patient who hadn't been conscious for days. The doctor in charge said he wouldn't last until morning, so I knew someone else would be in his bed when I came back to work the next day, but I just wanted to take a minute, I don't know, to say goodbye or I'm sorry or whatever it was you said to the people you failed to save. So she came into the patient's room with me, reminded me what time the party started, and to make sure I picked a few last-minute items up on my way home. I said I would, and then I picked up the patient's chart to record my last set of observations. I had to lift up the death certificate to do it. The doctor had already put it in there, signed it with the day's date and everything, which just made me want to cry for this guy they first didn't know. But when I put the chart down, I found him staring at me. This bloke, who couldn't have been any older than I was. And he said, I wouldn't mind being your date for the party. I've never been to a Halloween party before. I looked at him and he looked at me, and something unspoken passed between us, that all the things he hadn't done he never would now. So I blathered something about hospital procedures and how he was in safe hands here in hospital, and how parties weren't all they were cracked up to be, because I'd be mopping up vomit by morning for sure. He just nodded like he understood, and I left. I just left. She stared hard at the beer can. She couldn't meet Olaf's gaze now or she'd cry. She was probably going to cry anyway by the time this story was over, but now she'd started, she had to finish it. So I finished handover, stopped at the shops and went home. The house was full of people, inside and in the backyard, and maybe I had a few more drinks than I should have. Someone had invited some firestick twirlers, and everyone went outside to watch them, so I curled up on the couch, just for a minute. It had been a long day and a long week, and I'd had a bit to drink, so I fell asleep. The party ended. My roommate got called into work because babies like being born at stupid o'clock in the morning, and she just sort of tiptoed out without waking anyone or checking on anyone, because we were all supposed to be responsible adults, or adults anyway, and everyone else was still asleep. So I woke up on the couch mid-morning with a slight hangover, but nothing too bad. There was a guy there too, using my legs as a pillow, who'd fallen asleep on the other end of the couch. We're all fully clothed, nothing dodgy, so I just sort of slid my legs out from under him, letting him flop onto the couch as I got up. I don't know what it was. Whether he just didn't fall right or maybe I saw his face first or, I don't know. So I reached out to feel for a pulse. And it wasn't there. The guy was dead. I screamed for someone to call an ambulance, and I laid him down on the floor so I could start doing compressions. But even as I did, I knew it was no use. He was cold, and his skin was kind of gray, and even my alcohol-fogged brain was telling me he was a corpse, but I kept up those compressions until the ambulance arrived to take him away. It wasn't until about an hour later that I realized I knew him. He was the guy from the hospital. The patient I had definitely left behind in his room, who should not have been in my house, let alone on my couch. That's also about the time his parents turned up at the hospital, having rushed home from some remote hiking trip, absolutely hysterical that they weren't in time to say one last goodbye to their darling son. But when the hospital went looking for his body, well, it wasn't in the morgue now, was it? So his parents raised absolute fucking hell, calling everyone from the cleaners to the consultants incompetent, until they got a call that he'd been taken to the state mortuary for an autopsy, and they needed to come and identify him. The police got involved, hospital administration got involved. Every newspaper and reporter in the city turned into terriers, trying to bite my heels in search of the story. Never mind that it was my roommate who'd given him our address, not me, or that he'd discharged himself from hospital, gotten into a taxi, and invited himself into my house to crash my Halloween party, before collapsing on my couch to breathe his last. No, he was my patient, and people had taken pictures of us on the couch together, and the news got hold of all of it. They called me the fucking body thief because he'd entered a time on his own death certificate when he left the hospital that said he was already dead by the time he got into that cab, so the newspapers said I'd stolen his corpse. Someone said it was for necrophilia, while others said he was a macabre Halloween decoration, and I don't remember the rest. The police even came and arrested me as a fucking murder suspect. The hospital fired me. All because some selfish wanker called Amal wanted to spend the last hours of his life at my party. Freyja wiped away her tears with her hands. Even now it was still so fucking frustrating. Also unfair. She hadn't done anything wrong, except have a few adult beverages at her own house and fall asleep on her own couch. While Amal had just quietly died, and left her in the middle of a fucking shitstorm. The police dropped the charges eventually, after they found the cab driver who'd driven Amal to my house, because his story backed mine up, and so did the autopsy. But it was already too late for me. Between the media storm and the hospital's very public condemnation of my actions, stirred up by Amal's angry parents, I had no job, and no one was willing to hire the body thief. For a week I hid at home, scouring the job boards for something I could do, somewhere I could go where no one had heard about it. Finally I saw this job advertised. Carl was leading an expedition to the Jotunheimen Mountains, and he needed someone with experience in dissections to manage the lab here. I was the only one who applied with a medical degree, so he hired me on the spot. I scraped together some money for a plane ticket, and caught the next flight out. Freyja blew out a breath. She picked up her beer to take another swig, only to discover it was empty. So now I'm going to get drunk for the first time since that night, because as soon as the snow clears, the police are going to come here and probably arrest me again, because the body of a 1,000-year-old Viking that Carl entrusted to me is missing, and I have no fucking idea where it is. But because everyone knows I'm the body thief, everyone's going to blame me for it going missing. Just like last time. And when I lose my job this time, I don't know what I'll do. She glanced up, to find she'd been talking to herself. Olaf was gone. 22. Odin could not help but be mesmerized by Freyja. As her words flowed, she occasionally paused to take a swig from her ale, before she pursed her lips as though she did not like the taste. Every time she did this, Odin wanted to lean forward and kiss her, but he dared not interrupt. This telling was too important to her. She had given him a hug when he'd needed it most. He would do her the same courtesy, and give her his full attention, for as long as she needed it. There was much in Freyja's tale that Odin did not understand, but he could certainly sympathize with her trying to heal a man, only to lose him to illness, and then be accused of his murder. Never mind that she'd been found innocent, he could not have lived among people who would believe such a thing of him either. He'd been on the brink of saying so, when she'd mentioned the missing body of the 1,000-year-old Viking. 1,000 years. His mind had gone blank. Was that why he understood so little of the world around him? The witch had made him sleep for 1,000 years. Only to wake, frozen on Freyja's metal table, to both save her and turn her life upside down. His feet carried him swiftly out of the feasting hall and down to the lab, as she called it, where he'd first awoken. He could not pass through the walls to enter the cold storage chamber, but the stone floors yielded to him. He lay down on the table again, in the tub of icy water, and remembered the chill in his bones from being frozen for 1,000 years. His spear, all that was left of his things after all this time, for no tunic or cloak or boots survived that long. He almost wished he could return to that unknowing slumber, no longer beset by his crushing grief for Vali and Vidar, or the guilt at not having loved Frigg better. Or the loss of his men, leading them against Eric when he knew how vast the man's armies were, yet also knowing his men would choose to die in battle, avenging their families, so that they might see them in Valhalla, rather than live under Eric's rule. All but Thor and Loki. If he'd known he was bargaining not just his own life in service to the man who'd killed his family, but 1,000 years of sleep for the lives of his 2 remaining brothers in arms, he would do it again. And Freyja? Where did she fit in all of this? Eric's witch had commanded him to rise when she called, but Freyja was not that witch. Yet it was her call for help that had awoken him. She who compelled him to love her, to obey. Was this some sort of sorcery too? No, he decided. Freyja was not a witch, for all that she enchanted him. Love was a magic all its own, and he knew what he felt for her just as he knew he'd never loved Frigg. And he would never stop loving his lost sons. Not even if he lived another 1,000 years. But a lot could happen in 1,000 years. More than he could learn about in any maintenance manual. Perhaps he should have paid more attention to the other books in Freyja's scriptorium. The chamber where she slept, so he must hurry if he meant to borrow some of the books before she retired for the evening. Warming her bed was a wondrous thing, but he needed to understand her world, so that he could properly protect her. If that meant reading every book she had, then he would do so, and he would not return to her bed until he deserved her trust. 23. Freyja finished the chips, chasing them down with a cup of water, because she definitely didn't want another foul beer. When Olaf still didn't return, and her eyes grew heavy, she decided to go to bed, taking one of the lanterns with her. If Olaf was right, the solar panels would start working again when the sun rose, and there would be power in the building again. Light and heat and, most importantly, power for the coffee maker. She half hoped to find him in the bed they'd shared last night, keeping it warm, for it was going to be a cold night, without any power. But the library was cold and empty, so she stole a bunch of spare blankets from one of the guest rooms to help keep her warm through the night. He had to return eventually. Where else would he go? Then again, now he'd heard her dark secret, maybe he didn't want to share a bed with her, not even to keep warm. She remembered the horror in St. Nick's eyes when he'd mentioned the rumors of necrophilia, and he was a man who went after any woman on campus. But he kept well away from her. Could she blame him, really? Even if she hadn't been guilty of any crime, she was still a disgraced doctor, one no hospital or clinic would employ. It was only a matter of time before she became a disgraced lab manager, too. If she could find somewhere else to sleep, far from all her failures, she would too. She shucked off her jacket and her shoes, but left the rest of her clothes on for warmth, before burrowing under the blankets. But instead of her body warming them, the blankets only seemed to chill her further, stealing all her body heat until the chill invaded her very bones. It never got this cold back home. Had she made a mistake in coming here? Running halfway around the world to get away, when the rumors had still followed her? She'd hoped for a fresh start, and for a time she'd had one. Until the rumors had arrived, more virulent than any virus, so that not even the office sleaze would dare touch her. Not that she'd wanted attention from St. Nick, especially when rumor had it he preferred students and people he had power over, and he'd learned quickly that making false complaints about her wouldn't fly. She might be a disgraced doctor, but no one knew better than a medical professional how well good documentation could cover even the most sizable ass. Amal's wrongly dated death certificate had been her downfall, and it wasn't a mistake she'd ever repeat. Maybe she should have stayed home, where it was warm. She might not be able to practice as a doctor again, but there were surely some public health positions in dire need of experts right now. If her father really could pull some strings. She sighed, her breath condensing in the air. Fuck, it was cold. She'd give anything for Olaf to share her bed again tonight. Just for warmth. Nothing else, no matter how much she wanted it. She should never have told him her story. Especially not tonight. If there was any chance he might trip and bump his head, so he forgot the last few hours. No. She wouldn't wish that on anyone. Head injuries were tricky things, with complications that could go on for weeks or months or even years undetected. Maybe she was the damaged one, and she could blame all her bad decisions over the last few days on hitting her head when she'd lost control of the scooter, just before she'd met Olaf. If she could blame a head injury for all of her mistakes since then. No. Not even a head injury would explain away the missing body. Better for the injury to have been fatal, and she'd never know the consequences of her second fall from grace. Because she wasn't sure she had the strength to start over a third time. Maybe it was best that the power was out and she was freezing. If she succumbed to hypothermia tonight, no one would blame her for anything. Just like no one had dared pin the rightful blame on Amal for signing his own death certificate and escaping hospital to go to a party of all things. Was this how easy it had been for Amal? Just falling asleep, knowing you'd never wake up and have to face any consequences for your actions? She'd always felt sorry for him, when she hadn't been furious at him, wishing she could raise him from the dead, so she could kick him in the fork for fucking up her life. Selfish asshole. But right now, being selfish seemed like a really good idea. Slipping away so someone else could be held responsible for everything, just for once. Maybe they'd blame Olaf for the power outage, and he'd magically produce the missing body out of guilt. Then again, if she was really being as selfish as Amal, she'd want one more night with Olaf. One last almighty orgasm. She drifted off to sleep, dreaming about what she wanted but didn't dare have. 24. Odin heard Freyja's call as clearly as though she was sitting beside him, close enough to read the pages of the book he'd picked up. But no matter how much he longed to answer it, to join her in bed for all the delights her body could provide, he knew he hadn't earned that privilege yet. He had 1,000 years of history to catch up on. Maybe more, if he judged this history book correctly. He estimated he'd entered his enchanted sleep more than 1,200 years ago, before the death of Karl the Great, the emperor the book called Charlemagne. More interesting was the lack of reference to Jarl Erik and his conquests, though Erik had been no less ambitious. He couldn't help but wonder what had erased Erik from history's record, while Karl remained. Finally, he finished reading the books he had, and ventured back to the scriptorium for some more. He did not need sleep, like Freyja, but he took a moment to check on her all the same. Only to discover he'd been a fool. Yes, there were many dangers in this strange future he must protect her from, but some things did not change. The cold could kill just as readily now as it did in his time, and he would never have been careless enough to allow Frigg or his sons to sleep in such chilly conditions. For as Freyja slept, she shivered, something he could not, in conscience, allow to continue. He slipped beneath the blankets, taking her in his arms, even breaking out his wings to wrap around her, to warm her. She was softness itself, fitting into his embrace so perfectly it was like he'd been made for her. Or she'd been made for him. He breathed in her scent. Her hair smelled of some sort of fruit he did not recognize, but as his lips hovered over the nape of her neck, desperate to drop a kiss there, her scent grew saltier, yet also sweeter. Like she'd bathed in honey before going out on the roof with him to clear off the snow. Maybe that was why she tasted so very sweet. He dropped a kiss in the air above her neck, resisting every urge to offer her more. It would be so easy to slide down her trousers, to slip inside her wet heat, and warm her from the inside as well, as he gave her 1,000 kisses. But he did not, though he was harder than the living stone he was made of by the time she was warm, and he forced himself to leave her bed, taking another stack of books to occupy his mind, so that he might better protect her. Only when he properly understood this world he'd awoken in, would he be able to truly protect her as she deserved. Until he could protect her from every possible threat while she slept, would he permit himself to surrender to her pleasure when she woke. Protecting her should be motive enough for his studies, but more than once, Odin allowed his body to follow his wandering mind to her bed, where he might bury himself inside her, and revel in every clench as her muscles tightened around him, while she screamed for joy. But all he did was make sure she was warm enough before forcing himself back to his books. He would share this joy with her again, he promised himself as he turned his eyes to the page, to read what he had not yet learned. 25. The library was surprisingly warm when Freyja woke up. Or maybe that was just her makeshift bed on the floor. With so many blankets piled on top of her, it took considerable effort to climb out from under them. Yes, definitely the blankets, keeping the warmth in, she decided, pulling on her jacket. Sure, her breath wasn't condensing the moment it left her mouth anymore, but this was hardly a typical summer morning temperature. Even a Norwegian one. She headed back to her room for some clothes, and the way the temperature dropped as she entered the accommodation block, she almost began to believe the place might be haunted. It would be funny if it was the ghost of the guy whose body was supposed to be sitting in the necropsy freezer. They could look for his lost body together. Though it was unlikely, they'd find it before the university PR team and the police arrived. This might be her last morning as a free woman. So she took her time in the shower, now the hot water was working again, and debated whether she should use the last of the bread to make toast, or go for something more fancy, as her last meal here and all. Wait, was that pancake mix? She grabbed the packet. Yep, the sort that you only needed to add water to, so even she couldn't stuff them up. While the frying pan heated up, she dug out syrup and butter. No way was she eating margarine today if she'd be eating prison rations for the foreseeable future. She methodically poured, flipped, plated, then poured again, methodically making a stack of pancakes that would easily last her till lunch, and still there was way too much batter for one person. If Olaf was around, she'd offer to make some for him too, seeing as he was probably responsible for getting the backup power up and running again, but she hadn't seen any sign of him. Maybe he was already outside with the snowblower, clearing the way for the police to come and arrest her. So she shouldn't waste her last hour of freedom making pancakes for the traitor. Unless, making it easier for the police to come and get her put them in a better mood, and maybe they'd be nicer, or decide not to bother with handcuffs. Then again, with the university PR team here, including a photographer, her face would probably be splashed across all the newspapers again whether she wore handcuffs or not. Was it too late to contact Ingrid and tell her not to come? The police would turn up anyway, of course, but if she told Ingrid the body was missing, then maybe she wouldn't have to face the photographer. Small mercies. She fetched her laptop and opened it on the cafeteria table, making herself a second coffee while she waited for the Wi-Fi connection to start working, and load the emails that had come in while the power and the Wi-Fi were down. Amid the mess of spam and the usual generic notices from the university was an email from Ingrid, dated yesterday. Apparently, the roads were closed due to the unseasonable snow, so neither Ingrid nor the police would be able to get to the lab before next week, at the earliest. Was there any chance she could delay working on the body until then? so the police forensics team could have the first stab at it? Freyja wasn't sure whether she wanted to laugh or cry. Sure, she could absolutely keep her hands off the body, because she had no idea where the fucking thing was. But the snow had bought her a week's reprieve. What was the legal term for it? A stay of execution. Not that they had the death penalty here in Norway or back home either, but last time it had felt like her life ending, and she knew this time would be no different. She tapped out a vague email, agreeing to see Ingrid and whoever else was coming next week. What more could she say? She was stuck here, awaiting her fate, at least until the snow melted. What she needed was a miracle. What she had was Olaf, a massive lab facility and a whole lot of snow. And a week left of life as she knew it. Well, if she only had a week left, she might as well make a bucket list. She pulled up a blank page on her laptop screen and began to type. 1. Find the ice mummy and put it back in the fridge. Well, it was her priority, even if it was a long shot. Then again, how had they lured the mummy back into his tomb in that old movie? Freyja had a bad feeling a girl had sacrificed herself to be bait or something, and Freyja would take prison over seducing some long-dead Viking any day. No matter what the news or the rumors said, she was not into necrophilia. All she'd heard about Viking culture was that they loved their food, and their idea of heaven was a feasting hall in the sky. So, maybe a trail of fish would be better bait. They definitely had enough sardines and herring here to lure anyone from the road all the way to the necropsy lab, if need be. Fuck knew she wasn't going to be eating them, especially now the power was back on. Even if they ran out of normal food, or if the power went out again, she could take one of the portable gas burners the expeditioners used, and some of their dehydrated meals out into the courtyard and have a cookout. Last year even Lara had admitted those meals weren't bad, though they couldn't beat fresh food. Fish, however. Freyja buried her head in her hands. She must be going mad if she was actually considering this. Ice mummies, like any other mummified remains, didn't move, wouldn't respond to any kind of bait, virginal, piscine or otherwise, and, most importantly, couldn't get up and walk out of a fridge without someone carrying them out. So it wasn't the mummy she was trying to bribe, but the thief, which still left her with the problem that even a year's worth of smoked herring still wouldn't work. Freyja blew out a breath. Well, if she couldn't achieve the first item on her list, she needed more things she could actually tick off. 2. Pancakes for breakfast every morning. 3. Hawaiian pizza every day. 4. Another orgasm with Olaf. Freyja stretched for the delete key. She shouldn't even be thinking about him. Then again, if she was going to lose her job anyway because she failed to achieve the first item on the list, then she may as well do some bad things that weren't likely to land her in prison. She put her pinky back where it belonged on the keyboard, so she could add more to the list. 5. Another night with Olaf. 6. Destroy the sundial. 7. Drink the bottle of champagne Carl had had delivered with the ice mummy. He'd had a whole case of it sent to the expedition site, but he'd insisted on her having a bottle too. She'd planned on drinking it with the team or at least Carl when he got back, but now, she might as well guzzle the lot on her own. 8. Eat the last pack of Tim Tams. She'd brought a bunch in her suitcase with her, and she'd been saving the last packet for a special occasion. Better to eat them now than let them go bad while she was in prison. Maybe she should try to seduce Olaf with them. Maybe if she was really lucky, she wouldn't go to prison, and they'd just cancel her visa and deport her back to Australia. Then she could eat all the Tim Tams she wanted, while looking for another job. Though who would employ her after this, she had no idea. In the meantime, she intended to check if there were enough pineapple pizzas to achieve goal number 3.